missing anybody.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Annabelle Gonzalez, Deputy Director General of the WTO, and thank you very much for joining us for the launch of the report, Trade Therapy, Deepening Cooperation to Strengthen Pandemic Defenses. The report has been prepared jointly by the World Bank and the WTO. It is the latest in a string of joint studies and evidence of our strong resolve to use our partnership as a force multiplier in serving our respective members. I would also like to acknowledge the contribution that our colleagues from the World Health Organization made to this report. From the start, they provided valuable inputs and thoughtful comments and suggestions, which have enriched and improved the final product. So I want to congratulate everyone involved on turning an excellent report and also for having worked to very tight deadlines. Their efforts and commitment made it possible to issue the report at this critical moment, a week ahead of the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference. So indeed, now is the right moment to bring facts to the table to help us form a 360-degree picture of how trade contributes to global health security. Taking a clear-eyed look, as the report does, at how trade has bolstered our capacity to respond to the pandemic, but also where we have fallen short, is urgently needed. That's not just because this pandemic is far from over, but also because we cannot delay any longer the urgent work of preparing for the next global health crisis. So now is also the right time to bring objective, rigorous, and policy-relevant analysis to the unfolding debate about globalization and economic resilience. The pandemic has led some people to conclude that the way to strengthen resilience is by retreating from trade, that we can reduce vulnerabilities by unwinding supply chains and turning inward. And the report challenges this view. One of its main lessons is that trade plays a key role in ensuring access to medical goods and services and promoting innovation. And that makes trade a source of strength, not weakness, for global health security. None of this means, of course, that there weren't serious shortcomings. There were, as the report makes clear, and that's why it contains several pragmatic, concrete, and forward-looking policy actions that can help us to leverage trade to be more prepared and respond more effectively next time a health crisis hits. So with that, let me turn to the program for today. We will start with opening remarks by our Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and Mari Pangestu, Managing Director at the World Bank. Mari, Dr. Ngozi, thank you for being with us here today. After Dr. Ngozi and Mari's opening remarks, we will turn to Nadia Rocha from the World Bank with one of the report coordinator, along with her colleague, Michele Ruta, also from the World Bank, and my WTO colleagues, Mark Paqueta and Jocelyn Magdalene. Nadia will provide an overview of the report's main messages. After that, we will move to our panel discussion. We are very honored to have a stellar lineup of very distinguished speakers whom I will introduce in a moment. I also see that we have a large audience from around the world, so thank you all for joining us. Please do post your questions online and we will respond towards the end of the session. And with this, let's get started with our discussion. Dr. Ngozi, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Annabelle. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, and especially Mari, I'm very pleased to launch this joint World Bank WTO report with you. It underscores how trade is a force for good in terms of enabling access to medical goods and services, but also points to where we can improve. It's a timely reminder, a week ahead of our 12th Ministerial Conference, I can hardly believe that, of how trade is part of the solution to many of the big challenges of our time, whether in public health or the environment. Let me take a moment to thank Mari and the World Bank team for their collaboration, and to thank our wonderful team for their work as well. Our two institutions have now produced joint studies on trade and poverty, trade and gender, and more recently on the role of trade in strengthening developing countries' resilience. We continue to collaborate closely on analytical work on climate change, and we also joined forces with the IMF and the OECD to produce a report on subsidies that came out in April. This report complements the efforts of the Multilateral Leaders Task Force on COVID-19, where together with my counterparts from the World Bank, the IMF, and the WHO, we have worked to improve global health security. Let me say that this is what I think multilateral cooperation among institutions should be like. Though the pandemic has been replaced in the headlines by the conflict in Ukraine and the related food and energy crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic is by no means over. New diseases with pandemic potential will emerge, and we should not waste the opportunity to learn from this experience. This is why the report examines trade and trade policies in medical goods and services before and during the pandemic to identify what worked well and what did not. A main lesson of the report is that trade plays an important role in ensuring access to medical goods and services, both in normal times and as the past 2 years have shown in times of crisis. Open trade allows countries across geographical regions to access essential goods and services. It reduces costs and promotes innovation through research and development. During the pandemic, international trade in medical goods played an essential role. Trade in the wide set of medical products tracked by the report grew 13.2% in 2020, even as the value of world trade itself shrank by nearly 8%. Critical products such as face masks registered a 481% increase. Open trade, combined with government support, also spurred the innovation that led to the rapid development of vaccines. At the same time, however, the COVID experience has exposed weaknesses: excessive concentration of production, restrictive trade policies, supply chain disruptions, and regulatory divergence can jeopardize the ability of public health systems to prepare for and respond to pandemics, for instance, by constraining access to essential goods and services. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 130 countries have used a wide range of trade and trade-related policies, both trade facilitating and trade restricting, to bolster domestic availability of critical medical products. A common reaction to shortages has been to blame trade and call for reshoring, nearshoring, or friendshoring in order to achieve supply security for key medical products. But the report makes clear that improving global health security involves more trade and more international cooperation, not less. It also discusses how the WTO and the World Bank can help the world better prepare for and respond to future pandemics. The WTO could, for example, foster an agreement to lower barriers to trade in medical goods and services, which would improve the efficiency of healthcare systems and increase preparedness. Members could also commit to improve trade policy transparency, ensure that trade is not interrupted for countries in need, and consult with other economies to assess the adverse impact of measures on partners. And a balanced global intellectual property system would establish a solid basis for sharing technology and know-how to jointly develop crisis response capacity, including by increasing the geographical diversification of where countermeasures can be manufactured. I have to take this occasion to point out that MC12 offers WTO members a golden opportunity to act on these fronts by delivering a credible response to the pandemic. The ingredients are on the table. With pragmatism, flexibility, and a solutions-oriented approach, ministers can close the remaining gaps and agree on the WTO response to the pandemic text. Lives and livelihoods are at stake. Before I give the floor to Mary, let me reiterate that enhancing international cooperation on trade will improve our response to this pandemic and strengthen our defenses against the next one. Thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen, and Mary, over to you.
Thank you, Ngozi. Thank you, Annabelle, and thank you to everybody who have worked hard on this report. And welcome to everyone, especially Excellencies Minister Riyad Mizaur and Vice Minister Dr. Dante. I just want to also echo what Ngozi mentioned earlier, how much we have done collaborating together on many of the very challenging issues that the world faces today, and to really better understand how trade can actually further these efforts. So I'm really delighted to be here to launch the Trade and Health Report. And I just wanted to also add the context that we are meeting, which is, this overlapping crisis that started with COVID, and now we face the war in Ukraine, which is also disrupting food and energy markets, while at the same time we're still having facing the climate crisis. And Ngozi also mentioned, I think this is also a challenging time for globalization as we face growing calls for fragmentation of the world economic system. And calls, in terms of responding to more resilience in trade and supply of goods. The response has been more protectionism, friendshoring, nearshoring, onshoring, and so on. But we should know that history tells us that protectionism actually triggers a race to the bottom. And what we need is greater trade openness, not economic nationalism. And in all periods of recovery, trade and investment have always played a role. So I really just want to emphasize that. And our experience during the pandemic, and now with the recent food security crisis, it's clear that open trade for critical goods such as food and medical goods is key for addressing these food and health security issues that matter most to the poorest and most vulnerable people. So I just wanted to put that context on the table and really bring us to the topic for our discussion today, which is how can trade therapy, I really like your title, improve global health security and beyond. I think this report really highlights the crucial role for international trade in the COVID pandemic response, but also identify the shortcomings. Let me just re-emphasize 4 of the key messages, which is first, that international trade was crucial to the pandemic response. I think Ngozi mentioned the amount of trade that increased. And trade also supported the exchange of ideas and technology that led to the development of vaccines at unprecedented lightning speed, facilitated by fast-track approvals. And trade played a key role in the rapid production and delivery of those test vaccines, along with therapeutics and PPE. But the global system, secondly, fell short in some aspects. I think we all have gone through this in the last 2 years, how there was unequal access to vaccines because of advanced purchases, export controls, and the highly concentrated nature of medical goods production, which meant that we had uneven distribution. And this report actually puts the evidence-based analysis there that uncooperative trade policies not only restricted access, but also increased average trade costs of medical goods by as much as 60%, resulting in higher prices for consumers and obviously hurting the poorest and vulnerable the most. So to Ngozi's call for an opportunity at the WTO, upcoming WTO ministerial, at the G20, we had come up with principles of imposing export restrictions for emergency purposes, that they should be transparent, measured, targeted, and temporary, and be reported to the WTO, amongst other things. So I would really hope that we can push this very much in the multilateral trading system agreements, and hope that it can at least frame what you can and cannot do. Third, trade and regulatory cooperation can strengthen the resilience of supply chains and reduce the health costs. It is about lowering tariffs on medical products, trade facilitation measures to clear goods, and reducing import costs for ICT and business services. And again, evidence coming out of this report says that this can really increase income by more than 6 billion annually, with more than half of that accruing to low and middle income countries. And finally, cooperation beyond trade agreements will also be needed. I think we know a lot of the work that we are trying to push ahead. How can we have more address the concentration of production that was evident during the pandemic? How can we diversify hubs of production for the medical sector across the whole medical supply chain? And how can we have manufacturing facilities in low and middle income countries with the comparative advantage, obviously. And let me just close by saying that the World Bank Group and the WTO, we have both a unique role to play in supporting this effort together, as well as in what we each do. The World Bank is committed to developing countries build out more resilient health systems. We have 30 billion in our portfolio right now for strengthening health systems. And I just wanted to also point out that recently with the WHO and under the chair, excellent co-chairs of Indonesia and Italy in the G20, we have worked on how to address the gaps in pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. And the Multilateral Leaders Task Force of COVID-19, of which WTO, WHO, IMF, and am I missing one? IMF, WHO, WTO, and us. Yeah, 4 of us. That I think that work has been really tremendous. And I just wanted to point out the one issue that we had focused on, which was transparency of contracts and availability of vaccines. And this is very much in line with the recommendation coming out of the report on a global information clearinghouse. So I will join Ngozi by saying, let's not waste the lessons we've learned from this crisis. And really, we need to collectively work together to ensure that we can prevent, prepare, and respond much better and more effectively for the next pandemic. So now let me hand it over to the authors for a presentation of the report. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much to both Ngozi and Mari for your insightful remarks. We are grateful that you took the time to be, of course, with us today and for your tireless efforts to promote equity in vaccine production and distribution. I will now move on to the next part of our session, and let me call on to Nadia Rocha to present an overview of the joint report. Nadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Good morning to everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. Let me just share my presentation here. Can you please confirm that you can see it? Wait a second. Can you see it in presentation mode or not?
No, we see a small screen.
One second.
Nadia, you can go to display settings and change the screens as you just swapped them.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remove the panel from Zoom to be able to do that. And I am not being able to. So give me 1 second. Okay. I'll just do one more try. One second. Okay, here we go. 1 second. Okay, how about now?
Yes, it works.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for your patience. It is a pleasure to be here, and today I will be presenting the key findings of the report, Trade Therapy, Deepening Cooperation to Strengthen Pandemic Defenses. This report, as it has been mentioned already, is a collaboration between the World Bank and the WTO, and it incorporates inputs from a large group of people from these two institutions, as well as other institutions such as the WTO and the WHO, and the academia. While there are too many people to name, I would like to thank them all for their contributions. And I would like also to thank in particular the main coordinators, Mark Baqueta, Joslan Madeleine, and Michele Ruta, with whom it has been a pleasure to work in this project. So let me now move to the next slide. So we have seen that the COVID-19 pandemic, it has exposed the upsides and downsides of international trade in medical goods and services. And this experience shows that the world must be better prepared for the next pandemic that will inevitably arrive and that could even be more severe. This is indeed illustrated in this chart, which shows that the probability of a new pandemic that is going to be worse than the 1918 influenza has increased substantially over time. This increase in frequency of new diseases and epidemics implies substantial costs due to the loss of life and livelihood, but also due to increased demand for medical goods and services. Now, in this report, we studied how to leverage trade to support global health security. And the report does three main things. So it provides new data on the role in trade in medical goods and services and of medical value chains in the past decades. It also surveys the evolving policy landscape affecting trade in medical goods and services before and after the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, the report proposes an action plan to improve trade policies and deepen international cooperation to deal with future pandemics. Now, moving into some of the key findings of this report, as it has been mentioned before, trade played a key role for global health security during this pandemic. Before the pandemic, trade in medical goods was already growing at a faster rate than overall trade, as can be seen in this graph. But since the start of the pandemic, trade in medical goods soared by 13.2%, with critical COVID-19 products such as face masks registering a total of 481% increase in exports. This number contrasts the negative growth rates for overall trade that took place since the beginning of the pandemic. And it also highlights the key role that trade played in improving countries' access to essential medical supplies to deal with the health crisis. Now, in contrast to the rapid trade growth in medical goods, trade in medical services fell by 9% in 2020, mainly because of travel and border restrictions imposed by countries. Trade to the cross-border movement of patients and health workers, that is what you see in these figures as mode 2 and mode 4, they dropped respectively by 58 and 39%. This decline was, however, partly offset by the increase of cross-border supply of medical services, including telehealth. That is what we call mode 1 in this slide. And this mode 1 rose by 14% in 2020. This suggests that the pandemic and its associated lockdown measures accelerated the provision of medical services remotely. This was a trend that was already started a past decade. And also this pandemic provided the rise of digital health digital health services. Now, the pandemic has also showed some of the downsides of trade. Open trade, combined with government support, simulated the development of vaccines. And with the new technologies, this development of vaccines against COVID-19 was relatively fast and production accelerated. From nearly zero in 2020, more than 650 million doses were exported in December 2021 alone, and 4.4 billion in all of 2021. Now, although exports of vaccines significantly rose, the concentrated nature of production, together with supply chain disruptions and regulatory impediments, contributed to create scarcity problems and unequal distributions of supplies across the globe. And this is indeed highlighted in this figure, where you can see the the increases in imports across countries with different levels of income. And it is clear that middle and higher income countries represented the high share of imports since the beginning of 2021, and lower and low income countries, they started to receive the imports of these vaccines towards the second part of 2021. Now, the uncertain scale, severity, and duration of this COVID-19 pandemic, in addition to the imperative to overcome the urgent domestic shortages of medical supplies, shaped the restrictions and reforms of medical goods trade, and also allowed countries to apply certain discriminatory policies as like an exception of the WTO principles. The figure in this slide, indeed, it provides evidence on the patterns of imports and export policies, including, for instance, tariffs, taxes, quotas, and licensing requirements affecting COVID-19 related medical goods since the beginning of the pandemic. And from the figure, we can see that more than 2/3 of countries in the world resorted to policy interventions to ensure domestic accessibility of medical goods during the pandemic. In addition, more than 95% of these interventions lasted longer than 3 months, casting a little bit of doubt on their temporary, on the fact that they supposedly should have been temporary. Now, some of the measures imposed by countries, such as export bans or export restrictions, they actually worsened the global health security. And indeed, empirical analysis that has been prepared for this report suggests that trade policy measures significantly increased import trade costs for medical goods. As illustrated in the figure, trade policies contributed to increases in trade costs of more than 50% in critical products like face masks and other personal protective equipment, increasing in such a way consumer prices are also reducing their availability. Other measures that were imposed by countries, they on the other hand, they facilitated trade and they eased the regulatory bottlenecks and promoted also the diffusion of health technologies. For instance, countries expedited the transition from paper-based to electronic documents requested at the border for the importation of essential medical goods, and they also activated the emergency use authorization to fast-track the approval of vaccines and other medical goods. Beyond the border, governments also accelerated the use of subsidies to support the discovery and the production of vaccines and medicines, and this indeed had a significant positive spillovers across other countries. In the services sector, many countries also sought to temporarily liberalize regimes for the mobility of health professionals in order to be able to deal with the shortages of their health professionals and to deal with the health crisis. Well, so on the basis of the analysis in the report indeed proposes an action plan to strengthen trade contribution to global health security. And here in this slide, you can see some of the examples of the policies that are proposed in this action plan. But this is not an exhaustive list, and the plan covers a broad range of trade and trade-related policy areas, and also it distinguishes between actions to enhance preparedness and actions to respond to the crisis. Just to provide some examples, areas of cooperation through existing channels include, for instance, opening trade in medical goods and services. We have done some modeling for our report, and this analysis suggests that lowering tariffs on medical products and reducing import costs for information and communication technologies and business services in the health sector, it would actually increase income by more than 6 billion annually, with more than half of this increase accruing to low and middle income countries. Trade agreements could also envision ways to coordinate subsidies for the development of crisis-related medical goods. To conclude, there are some steps for international organizations to leverage trade to improve health security. And these, for example, cooperation could aim, for instance, at mobilizing resources in order to improve the access to vaccines and other essential products in low-income countries, and also to expand their supply and distribution capacity. the establishment of a global information clearinghouse could also support the production of critical medical products and would also be useful or would also serve as a platform for companies to report bottlenecks, improve visibility on production capacity and distribution, and also to identify measures to respond to the pandemic. As I was mentioning before, this was a short presentation with the key findings of the report, but we invite you to go to the webpage that you can see in this page to go and download the full report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for that presentation, and congratulations to you, to Michele, Mark, and Jocelyn for an excellent study. Well done. Now, I would like to turn to our very distinguished panel. We are privileged to have with us today leaders from government, the WHO, and academia to share their perspectives on the report. Let me introduce His Excellency Riyad Mansour, Minister of Industry and Trade of the Kingdom of Morocco. Minister, we are truly honored that you could join us. I also am very pleased to introduce Deputy Minister Dr. Dante Saxono Harbuono, Vice Minister of Health of the Republic of Indonesia, and thank you very much for being with us. Dr. Mariangela Batista Galvao Simao, Assistant Director General and our dear colleague at the World Health Organization. And last but not least, Thomas Boyke, Director of the Global Health Program at the Council on Foreign Relations in the US. To all of you, a big thank you for being here with us. I would like to ask each one of you to react to what you've heard so far and to offer your views on the following. First, the contribution of the report to the current debate about the upsides and downsides of trading medical goods and services. And second, your thoughts on how you see the way forward with regard to improving trade policies and deepening international cooperation to deal with future pandemics. So, Minister, let me start with you, please. The floor is yours.
Bonjour. Madame la directrice générale de l'OMC, Madame la directrice générale de la politique de développement et de partenariat de la Banque mondiale, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs. Je tiens tout d'abord à vous exprimer le regret de M. Riyad Mansour, ministre de l'Industrie et du Commerce du Royaume du Maroc, de ne pas pouvoir être parmi nous pour une contrainte de dernière minute. En son nom, j'ai l'honneur d'adresser ce remerciement à Madame la directrice générale de l'OMC et Madame la directrice générale de la politique de développement et du partenariat de la Banque mondiale pour l'organisation de cette rencontre et d'avoir invité le Maroc pour y participer. Qu'il me soit permis également d'exprimer ses sincères félicitations à tous les experts des deux organisations pour les efforts fournis dans l'élaboration de ce rapport. Nous sommes persuadés que les débats de cette rencontre offrent une excellente occasion pour une meilleure concertation sur les actions communes à entreprendre pour un système commercial multilatéral libre, juste et équilibré. Permettez-moi d'abord de vous rappeler au cours du contexte de la pandémie COVID-19 et sous la conduite éclairée et proactive de Sa Majesté le roi Mohammed VI, que Dieu l'assiste, le Maroc a fait preuve d'une forte résilience économique en s'appuyant sur les stratégies sectorielles mises en place et les multiples initiatives prises sur les plans économiques et sociaux. À ce titre, le Maroc a déployé diverses actions d'urgence de lutte contre l'expansion de la pandémie en instaurant un système de veille épidémiologique et en déployant une politique de communication quotidienne permettant d'évaluer la pertinence des actions entreprises et d'ajuster la décision entre les impératifs de santé publique et la nécessité de redynamisation de la vie sociale et économique. Aussi, le Maroc a-t-il su mettre en œuvre dans le cadre de sa gouvernance une stratégie de réponse s'articulant autour de 3 mécanismes. Un comité de pilotage pour assurer le suivi de la situation épidémiologique et prendre les mesures nécessaires. Un comité scientifique et technique national chargé du suivi des aspects médicaux et scientifiques relatifs à cette pandémie. Et enfin, un comité de veille économique qui associe plusieurs départements ministériels aux côtés des représentants du secteur financier et des opérateurs économiques chargés d'étudier et de proposer des solutions idoines aux répercussions de la pandémie. Dans ce contexte, le Maroc n'a ménagé aucun effort pour augmenter la capacité des structures d'accueil hospitalière, moyennant une enveloppe budgétaire spéciale de plus de 222 millions de dollars. En sus, et en s'appuyant sur ses propres moyens de production de biens nécessaires dans la lutte contre l'expansion de la pandémie, le Maroc a procédé, moyennant une transformation des processus de fabrication de certaines unités industrielles pour les adapter à la fabrication de produits de protection tels que les tabliers, les blouses, les gants, les écrans faciaux, les masques, les hydroalcooliques, mais aussi certains dispositifs médicaux plus sophistiqués, tels que les respirateurs, les kits de prélèvement d'échantillons, les tests de diagnostic rapide, des thermomètres infrarouges ou encore des lits anti-Covid. Excellences, mesdames et messieurs, ne s'arrêtons pas sur ces avancées. Le Maroc a lancé en janvier 2022 une usine de production de vaccins, y compris un vaccin anti-Covid-19, en tant que projet structurant de nature à satisfaire ses besoins en vaccins et de contribuer à répondre à ceux de l'ensemble de notre continent africain. Cette unité sera opérationnelle en 2024. Sur le registre économique et social, mon pays a misé sur la transition numérique en simplifiant les procédures administratives et en renforçant les interventions de l'agence marocaine chargée de la mise en œuvre de la politique gouvernementale en matière de digitalisation. En outre, une série de décisions visant à soutenir les familles ouvrant dans le secteur informel et affectées par cette situation ont été entreprises au profit des salariés et des entreprises. En matière de soutien à l'investissement et de facilitation de l'accès au marché, le Maroc a alloué une enveloppe de 13,3 milliards de dollars, soit l'équivalent de 11% de son PIB, en vue d'initier une relance progressive de ses activités économiques tout en facilitant l'accès au financement de très petites et moyennes entreprises. À cet effet, un fonds d'investissement souverain de près de 24 milliards de dollars a été mis en place en vue de dynamiser l'investissement public et d'augmenter les capacités de l'économie nationale, de financer et accompagner les grands chantiers et d'intervenir dans des fonds sectoriels spécialisés et affiliés selon les priorités imposées par chaque phase et fonction des besoins des secteurs concernés. Aussi, et afin de surmonter les crises liées à la pandémie de la COVID-19, le Maroc a-t-il déployé des plans de relance économique, notamment la mise en œuvre des plans de relance industrielle 2021-2023, ainsi que des plans de relance des structures du secteur du tourisme, d'artisanat, de l'économie sociale et j'en passe. Excellences, mesdames et messieurs, en conclusion et en termes de résultats, la politique proactive du Maroc a permis au secteur industriel de récupérer à lui seul près de 100% des emplois perdus lors de cette pandémie. Le taux de croissance économique au titre de l'année 2021 s'est élevé à 7,4%, lui permet de consolider sa place parmi les 5 plus grandes économies du continent africain. Cette sortie de crise a été rendue possible grâce à une campagne de vaccination qui a déjà touché plus de 67% de la population marocaine. Le Maroc salue la solidarité et la cohésion dont ont fait preuve les institutions internationales, l'ONC, la Banque mondiale, l'OMS et autres organisations et leur mobilisation pour contribuer à la lutte contre les répercussions de la pandémie de COVID-19. Permettez-moi de conclure, d'inviter la communauté internationale et apporter son soutien et sa contribution pour assurer un retour rapide et approprié à une dynamique positive de la relance économique globale pour assurer la prospérité à tous. Je vous remercie pour votre aimable attention.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre. Thank you very much for sharing with us the experience of Morocco. Let me now turn to Dr. Dante Saxono to hear, please, Indonesia's views on the report and the way forward. Dr. Dante?
Thank you, Honorable WTO Directors Generals, World Bank Managing Director, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Current resources mobilization scheme is not enough to protect life of our people. At the early stage of today's pandemic, most of us face an extreme shortfall of resources, such as vaccines, drug testing, kits, and personal protective equipment. Interestingly, it was not only an issue of the money, but also the equal production of available of materials. This incident should be never be happen. Thus, I believe that this discussion is a wake-up call for us to reflect on every policy that can ease our resource mobilization during and prior to pandemic crisis. As Indonesia assumed the G20 presidency and having seen 6.3 million deaths of COVID, we are committed to rearrange the global health architecture to improve our cooperation in pandemic defense. First, we encourage countries to build a global health system resiliency by synergizing financial and essential health resources mobilization, and at the same time, optimizing the global genomic data sharing platform trusted by scientists around the world. We believe in the importance of highly functioning finance mechanism to help countries in need prepare during the peacetime and respond during the wartime. The pandemic better. Going forward, we have to build a mechanism to mobilize resources so that emergency medical countermeasures are accessible to all. Second, harmonizing global health protocol standards. To revive the global mobility of people and goods, it is essential to ensure the comprehensive health protocol standard to safeguard the world from future disease outbreaks. We need to harmonize global health protocol standards in international travel to allow for rapid social and economic recovery. Among others, by enabling digital application to mutually recognize health information systems for cross-border mobility. Third, expanding global manufacturing and research hubs for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. The world demands new way of thinking about the health system, and we should not put our eggs only in one basket. We need to expand the global manufacturing capacity of health products, particularly for vaccines, therapeutic, diagnostic, and personal protective equipment. Together, we need to better streamline the essential measures supply chains to reinforce health system globally. Ladies and gentlemen, at a time when COVID-19 has exploited our weakness and division, we must come together as a global community to peaceful cooperation that extend beyond this crisis. Building our capacity and system will take time and require sustained political, financial, and social commitment over many years. I wish this joint report of World Bank and WTO can significantly improve global essential health resource and manufacturing capacity. Only by investing in what matters, we can minimize the socio-economic impact of the future pandemic. Let us, guided by solidarity, fairness, transparency, inclusiveness, and equity, to make this commitment, and really because a change is not on as strong as its weakness link. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Dante, for sharing your views and highlighting the important role of cooperation in addressing a pandemic. Before I turn to Dr. Maria Angela Batista Galvao-Simao, let me remind our audience that we will have a Q&A session at the end of this panel. So please get ready to send your questions. So Maria Angela, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And first, let me thank WTO and the World Bank for the report, and also for inviting WTO to this launch. We know that trade measures play a critical role for ensuring access, improve quality, and influence prices of medical technologies, right? Because on one hand, we have the promotion of research and development. On the other hand, we need to ensure that innovations are affordable and available for those who need them at the time they need them. And this pandemic actually highlighted the importance of equitable access to safe, efficacious, and quality-assured medicines, vaccines, PPEs, and other health products. And this as the backbone of response to pandemics. There's a huge interest right now, contributing to global health security and to achieving universal health coverage, which we already knew. And I like that the report highlights how trade in medical goods and services is highly concentrated. And let me say that in one side, we see high-income countries consuming a large part of what's actually produced, while the production of like active pharmaceutical ingredients, raw materials, finished products is increasingly concentrated in countries like China and India. And we saw the risk of supply chain disruptions that happened during this pandemic, right? So I'd like to agree with all the panelists before and also with the report findings that it's extremely strategic to diversify manufacturing capacity. We are seeing that key new technologies like mRNA and some of the biotherapeutics, they remain concentrated in very few manufacturers. So the time to invest in local production is now, so that we can be better prepared for other pandemics, right? And on the issue of trade restrictions, I think we all saw that when export bans were applied during this pandemic, we saw shortages in places. So the inequality in the distribution. For example, in the case of the export ban affecting a very strategic vaccine that was provided through COVAX, we saw the immediate impact in low and middle income countries, but there were other examples of export bans going against public health interests. We also saw another trade issue, which because of the bilateral agreements between high-income countries and manufacturers, how they skewed the market and how they made timely and equitable access to COVID vaccines and almost impossible during 2021. Despite the enormous efforts of the COVAX partnership. I think this has to be said. And also to recognize that intellectual property is a trade barrier, and during this pandemic situation, it was associated with an unwillingness to engage in voluntary technology transfer from key IP holders. And it impacted the response, and it will impact the next pandemic if we're not careful. Of course, WHO is following very closely the negotiations that are taking place in the TRIPS Council. So I spoke a little bit about problems. Let me give 3 positive examples. First, WHO established the COVID Technology Access Pool in partnership with 43 member states. And we have already public health-oriented license being finalized for in vitro diagnostics and vaccines that were supported by the US government through the National Institutes of Health. and by Spain through the Spanish Research Council. The second example, and Indonesia is part of this initiative, is the mRNA Hub, which is located in South Africa with several spokes, as a partnership that provides a solid basis for sharing technology and know-how on how to jointly develop mRNA capacity. And that this is also to respond to health crisis, but also to diversify geographically the manufacturing capacity. And the third example I want to use positively is on the regulatory of health products side, because you know that WHO has put in place the emergency use listing, and it was critical for the uptake of vaccines at country level, not only because this enables international procurement, but also because it increased reliance. We had more than 150 low and middle income countries issuing close to 3,500 authorizations of vaccines in their territory in a very, very speedy process. So we had downsides on this pandemic, but we did also have some upsides. Let me quickly say a few comments on the report's proposed policy actions. And I see that one of the buckets is the regulatory work, and I'm going to talk. I know when we talk about regulation, it's not only health regulation, it's also about trade regulation. But let me talk about the health products regulation, because one of the WHO's priorities is strengthening the national regulatory authorities in all regions, and we are using a benchmarking tool to guide capacity building in countries. As of last year, we had more than 100 national regulatory authorities who were not functional authorities, and I'm happy to inform that we have, for example, in the African continent, 47 member states are engaged in this global benchmarking tool process at various stages. 4 are already at maturity level 3, which means they are functional authorities, and 4 are at an advanced stage of assessment. And let me say that local production, to be viable, it needs strong regulatory oversight. And I think one of the comments, one of the questions in the chat is about quality assurance, right? Another priority that WHO priority is very aligned with this report is the continuous efforts to enhance harmonization of regulations at regional and global level through mutual recognition, equivalence regimens, and this is very much at the heart of the reliance mechanisms I mentioned before. One good example in terms of managing IP, right? Because there is an ongoing collaboration between WTO, WIPO, and WHO to implement a balanced global IP system, and including through support to the full implementation and use of the TRIPS flexibility. But we recently established jointly a technical assistance platform to support countries that are having challenges in the interface of trade, intellectual property, and access to health products. Let me say also that WHO, of course, is very supportive of pool procurement mechanisms. This is in line with the report. And we think it's important to ensure transparency on transactions and affordable prices. And let me conclude by saying that this report comes at a very timely time, because the future of health, the health architecture for emergencies is being discussed. And it's very much these discussions are being built on experience from this pandemic, including through the A Accelerator. And let me say and thank Dr. Ngozi for her leadership in the first year and a half of the Accelerator as an example of an end-to-end integrated mechanism for development and deployment of medical countermeasures. Now you are entering the WTO ministerial event, and WHO has just finished the World Health Assembly. right? In the World Health Assembly, Dr. Tedros outlined the 10 solutions for strengthening the global architecture for health emergency, preparedness, response, and resilience. And as we speak, member states are negotiating the terms of a pandemic treaty or another time of binding agreement that we hope will be approved at the WHA in 2024. So let me say, to conclude by saying that mechanisms being put in place need to ensure that we don't face the same inequity in access problems in the next pandemic. And let me say, it's up to us to make sure they work well and respond to public health needs. Thank you very much, Annabelle.
Thank you, Mariangela, for all those very important remarks that you've made. Let me now turn, last but not least, to Thomas Boyke. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. My greetings to WTO Director General Kanjali Walla, as well as World Bank Managing Director Pangestu and other distinguished guests. I'm honored to have this opportunity to speak at the launch of this important report. I think it makes a strong contribution. It's comprehensive, it's practically minded, and clear in its analysis and its prescriptions, and I commend the authors on it. I think the fundamental message of the report is the right one, which is that trade and regulatory policies have an essential role in creating the enabling environment for the scaling up and scaling out of the production of essential medical goods to respond to COVID-19, but also to future pandemic threats. The reason for that is simple. Very few, if any, countries can sustainably do what is needed to be done in a crisis by themselves. Vaccine production and distribution, for example, depends on the cross-border movement of goods, services, and investment. And that message comes across clearly in the report. As the report clearly lays out, the record on trade in medical goods and services in this pandemic has been mixed. An underreported story, which I was pleased to see in the report, was that in many cases, the day-to-day import and export of vaccines and the raw materials and components continued without significant interruption, even in a global crisis, saving millions of lives and livelihoods. Close to half of the vaccine doses produced in 2020 and 2021 were exported. Governments instituted trade facilitation measures, regulatory policy measures to expedite these flows, often with the support of intergovernmental institutions like the WTO, the World Bank, and the World Health Organization. In this regard, in these cases, the system worked. But there were notable exceptions, and those exceptions mattered a great deal in this pandemic. Trade policies in some cases hindered equitable access to vaccine doses and other medical supplies for critical time periods, particularly early in the pandemic, and particularly to low and lower middle income nations. Export restrictions have also hindered the efficient scale up of vaccine production and investment. Fear of export restrictions may have discouraged governments from adequately subsidizing the cross-border production of critical inputs for vaccines, capital equipment like bioreactors or filtration pumps, raw materials, single-use materials like vials, filters, tubing, disposable bags, and so forth. My work with Chad Bown, which was kindly cited in this report, suggests that inadequate subsidization of cross-border inputs was a key limiting factor in the scale-up of vaccine production necessary in order to meet global needs. So let me emphasize 4 areas which are talked about in the report where trade policy can enable a better response to future pandemic threats. The first is negotiation of strong disciplines on export restrictions in pandemics. The solution of increasing geographic diversity of vaccine manufacturing globally is necessary, but not sufficient to address the phenomenon of export restrictions or nationalism, nor will be the approach of building vaccine production in small population countries. The reason for that, again, is that few countries can build everything they need for vaccine production. Small markets in particular will be dependent on cross-border supplies. Unpredictability on when those supplies will arrive will undermine the scaling out of vaccine manufacturing globally. It's important, there are proposals to make sure export restrictions are temporary. And again, this report very usefully points out that they were hardly so in this crisis. But it is maybe more important to focus on excluding the use of export restrictions from particular recipients, like humanitarian mechanisms like COVAX or their regional equivalents. That would provide the predictability needed for vaccine production, which relies on inputs coming on time and according to the regulated standards. And it would also encourage participation of governments in those humanitarian mechanisms by restricting the use of export restrictions to apply to them. The second area where we should see trade policy or trade policy could make a difference is through increasing supply chain visibility. And this is referenced in the report too around global information surveillance, but it's critical that we have more of a watchtower function on supply chains of critical medical supplies and forecasting in order to reduce the unnecessary use of export restrictions and encourage better planning. The third area, as the report notes, is the linkage of regulatory cooperation and trade can often be promising. There is a history of equivalence and mutual recognition agreements in the pharmaceutical area, a history of joint reviews between regulatory authorities, improving the quality of regulation, but also streamlining potential regulatory barriers. But those systems do need to be designed with, of course, national regulatory authorities' full participation and their priorities in mind. Often where those agreements succeed is when they're about work sharing and ensuring, and when they ensure that the ultimate formal decision on approval still rests with the national regulatory authority. Fourth and last, we need a mechanism to facilitate the transfer of pandemic relevant intellectual property between crises. It is not enough to respond once the crisis has occurred. This could be accomplished through governments, academics, philanthropic funders of vaccine R&D, building obligations into their licensing agreement to transfer pandemic relevant vaccine technology to qualified producers in underserved regions. Funders can work with recipient nations to provide training and ensure production meets international regulatory standards and transferred intellectual property is still protected. There is approaches that can address parties' needs in this regard, again, in between crises, and we need to pursue them. Last, I'll just conclude that I wholeheartedly agree with the conclusion of this report that trade policy can be part of the solution. And I think this report is an important contribution in showing how that can occur. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom, to you and all the panelists really for excellent insights and reflections on the topics covered by this report. We've had a few questions from the audience which have been responded as we were speaking. So let me now invite, of course, our audience to continue to post questions. But let me also turn back now to the authors of the report and see whether they would like to comment on any of our participants, of our panelists' views that are being expressed right now. Any comment from the authors? So we also have another question now, which is from Ahmad Parvez Khan, which is asking whether you think, and I think this goes to the authors, that the countries need to bring about changes in their respective trade policies from the pandemic perspective, and how far this is important as trade in medical goods and services contributes to global health security. And this goes, I think, to the point that Tom was making, and I think some of the other panelists as well. So I don't know whether Michele, you would like to come in, or Nadia or Mark or Jocelyn would like to comment on this.
Annabelle, thank you. I can jump in very quickly. So first of all, thank you everyone for the insightful comments. We really appreciated them. I will not go into the details, but the short answer to the question is yes, there is a need also for national reforms. And actually, I would use this opportunity as an encouragement to those who are interested to look at the report. We spent quite a bit of time in table 4.1, which is the last table in the report, to have an action plan. In the action plan, the emphasis, including this presentation that Nadia gave, was especially on what we can do together. So the cooperative responses of governments in the context of trade agreements, or the cooperative responses of international organizations. In the table, we have a column where we emphasize the national responses, so what countries can do unilaterally, so to say, without waiting for others to act. And we also make a distinction between measures that will help preparedness to future crises, health emergencies, and those measures that will allow to improve the policy response to the current health crisis. So just an encouragement to look at the report. The report is already online, and the policy action plan is actually quite detailed. It's a very long table with many practical suggestions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Michele. I would like to come to Mari and seek her views as well on our discussion. But before doing that, let me ask Minister Mazur and Deputy Minister Saxono their views on the following. Several of you have mentioned the importance of diversification of production. Certainly, Mariangela did, and Tom was saying that yes, this is important, but it's also important that diversification is thought through, among other issues, a number of trade policy measures that he referred to. So I would like to ask Minister Mazur or Deputy Minister Saxono, how do you see from the perspective of your country that these different trade policy measures were helpful in allowing, for instance, the manufacturing of vaccines in Morocco by accessing critical inputs, or by developing a successful vaccination campaign, for instance, in Indonesia? So can I come back to you on these questions, Minister or Deputy Minister?
Merci, Madame, pour cette précision-là et cet éclaircissement. Vous savez que la pandémie, il fallait en tirer des leçons de la problématique que nous avons eue. Et du coup, il fallait avoir la volonté et la concertation avec toutes les parties prenantes. Et donc, le sujet du vaccin était un sujet important. Et d'ailleurs, nous sommes mobilisés tous, je dirais, parties prenantes du sujet, que ce soit la partie gouvernementale ou le secteur privé ou les agences. Et sur ça, nous sommes arrivés à vacciner les 2 tiers. On met en place une facilité sur la digitalisation, en s'appuyant sur la digitalisation, et on a pu faciliter, on va dire, le vaccin. Aujourd'hui, on a plus de 2 tiers de la population qui est vaccinée. S'agissant du vaccin, nous sommes très conscients de l'importance du vaccin. Nous avons fait le réglage nécessaire, le montage financier, et on s'est lancé, bien sûr, avec nos partenaires dans une unité de fabrication du vaccin, donc que ce soit des seringues ou de l'actif lui-même. Et donc, nous serons opérationnels dès 2024. Donc, une fois que la volonté est là, la conscience est là, on pourrait agir. Et donc, notre production aujourd'hui n'est pas destinée uniquement au marché marocain, mais également pour servir en partie avec nos partenaires, le marché également africain. Et donc, nous sommes ouverts, bien entendu, à une collaboration et un partenariat avec nos partenaires pour partager, on va dire, notre expérience, que ce soit sur la gestion de la pandémie, sur la gestion de l'approvisionnement, sur le processus de vaccination, mais aussi sur le processus de fabrication des vaccins.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister Mesur, for your remarks. Deputy Minister Saxono, would you like to come in?
Yes, the expanding global manufacturing and research hub for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response is very important. The world demands new way thinking about the health system. So we need to expand global manufacturing capacity of health products, particularly of vaccine, therapeutic and diagnostic, and also personal protective equipment. So I think this is important to emphasize that the essential countermeasures supply chains to reinforce health system globally is very important. This is for me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maria Angela, can we have a quick word from you on cooperation among international organizations to strengthen pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response? The WHO, IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO have worked together in the context of COVID-19 of the Multilateral Leaders Task Force. Can we build on this experience to strengthen this cooperation to support our member governments?
Hey, Annabelle, thank you for the question, because I was reflecting on this right now. It's how do we make sure, and I think this partnership, this innovative partnerships, like WTO, WIPO, and WHO work together a long time, but then the WTO and the World Bank coming together, and this with WHO and the MOT, it's an innovative ways of working, right? And then also like the FTA as well. But I was thinking that how do we ensure, and what's the balanced approach that we can get by putting together the efforts? Because there are the three things that are on the table in this report highlights. One is trade, right? The other is IP, and the third is public health interest, right? So I think the efforts have to converge on the centrality of health and well-being. So these other systems have to work for us to have healthier population and to be able to go through the next pandemic. I think Nadia put a very green outlook in terms of the next pandemic. And I'd say I want to, next time there's a big pandemic like this one, I want to be back home, not having to try to sort it out. But it's the centrality of health in our approach. That's what I think it's super important to highlight in the mechanism that we have put and we put together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria Angela. Tom, the report calls for the establishment of a global framework to ensure the equitable allocation of vaccines worldwide. And you co-directed a project at the Council on Foreign Relations that resulted in a report that asked for, also for a proposed framework for leveraging trade for vaccine equity. Can you, in a couple of words, share a bit more about this?
Yeah, thank you. We did a report with Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security on this point, so I want to make sure I'm acknowledging their contribution as well. The agreement on equitable allocation is fundamentally underlined by policies that can ensure countries are confident that they will actually receive what they're promised on time. And that, from that perspective, the trade and regulatory policy issues that are talked about in this report are critical. That if there isn't more confidence that such collective mechanisms can actually deliver in a crisis and that people won't revert to a Me Too approach, then it's difficult to advance that. To do that, we need restrictions on export restrictions, but we also need reciprocity and dependence. The key to international cooperation is reciprocity. So Annabelle, I share the point that your Director General and you made as well, and the Managing Director did about the fear of how nearshoring or onshoring is being used to reduce independence in a way that may make us less able to scale up in response to future crises and cooperate.
Thank you. Thank you. That's an excellent point indeed. So Mari, let me come back to you to help us give a final remark in closing this event, please.
Thank you, Annabelle, and thank you everybody for the excellent presentation of the report, as well as all your inputs and comments and insights. Obviously, a lot more work needs to happen, but at least this report shines the light with evidence as to where the areas of lessons learned from the way we managed the last pandemic. And I think that's kind of like a big question out there, apart from the trade issue. If we had another pandemic, how would we, all the different organizations, how would governments and other stakeholders need to engage and respond so that we don't have the delay and all the uncertainties that we faced with this crisis. So on the trade aspect, I think I couldn't agree more with all the sentiment, including from the Indonesian Vice Minister, how to have, make sure health, people and goods move and very mobile, and all the issues around trade restrictions. I think that's really key. And the MC12 does offer you the opportunity to try to put on the table, at least from the multilateral trading system perspective, how can we have strong disciplines, as Tom was saying, on export and import restrictions. And we can put it there, but we all know, how do you actually enforce it? How do you you have to have other things happen at the same time to ensure that it's not just a question of reporting, but how to enforce it. Where does the peer pressure come in for a good behavior, not just by the state, I would say also the non-state actors, whether it's the pharmaceutical companies and so on. So I think maybe the work of our multilateral task force between the 4 international organizations should continue in that vein. What is the role of pharmaceutical companies when you do have a pandemic, in terms of making sure you are going to provide equitable access and so on, and also the pricing. Second point I would make is that I think the whole discussion about deconcentrating the manufacturing it's not just simply, okay, we're going to relocate here. Obviously, we have to make sure that it's going to work in an effective way, and that is about knowing how the supply chain works and how to facilitate the supply chain to happen. And as Tom said, not everybody can produce everything, right? And that is really the key when we are talking about global value chains and comparative advantage. Here, you got to do it in 2 ways. You got to make sure you can remove all the bottlenecks, whether it's regulatory or whether it's the import and export of the goods and the inputs. But also build the capacity in country, whether it's the research capability, whether it's the laboratory capacity, and so on, right? The capacity of the country to be able to go into the higher parts of the value chain, or even if they can't, even if it's just filling, if it's just focusing on the PPE, that's all part of, I think, a bigger questions that we need to answer and help countries identify and look at it as a regional supplier, right? And see how you can actually have regional cooperation support the global cooperation. A final point, I think there's a lot of discussion about two final points. One is on the streamlining and regulatory cooperation. I think this is hugely important. Equivalence, MRA, this is part of, it's both the health and the trade side. As a former trade minister, I distinctly recall in a lot of our trade negotiations and trade agreements, this was always an issue. And how do we have mutual recognition agreements? How do we create the standards, the standards that are national, but also going to a harmonization, whether at the regional or international level. So I think the issue of standards, both on the health and the trade side, is hugely important. And finally, I just wanted to pick up a point that nobody actually said anything about, except for the Indonesian Vice Minister, which is something that I think is actually crucially important, which is mobility of people. Because making sure that we have the health protocol standards so that we can have movement of goods and people, right? The people part, is going to be hugely important to support the recovery in trade and services, investment, tourism, business, travel, and so on. So I actually think this is a very important immediate area which can help the role of trade in recovery. And how do you harmonize the international health, travel health protocols and using digital application? For those of you who have been traveling recently, you will, they have, every country has different requirements, different standards, and you got to do different tests. And it is a pain, right? So it seems to me that's a kind of something that we should be prioritizing, and you could start with it regionally. Even Europe tried to do it regionally. I don't think it really has worked. They had tried to do the European system, but I'm not sure it's really worked, because I traveled in Europe and they had different requirements. So, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Europe, I think that to me is one area where perhaps all of us can work together to see how we can make some progress on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mari, for those remarks. A lot has been said today, but unfortunately we are out of time. We will be making the recording of the event will be available on the WTO website. And of course, we have the report. Please share it with your colleagues, friends, and followers on social media. Thank you very much to our distinguished panelists and to everyone who tuned in. Thanks again for your participation. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.